In order to meet the stakeholder objectives, you need to know what they require. In this lesson, we'll inquire on the process that helps to gather this information, the Collect Requirements process. The Collect Requirements process helps the project manager understand what kind of results are anticipated by the sponsor and the stakeholders. It's also used to figure out the kind of resources that are needed for the project. It uses active stakeholder involvement to determine any conditions and capabilities the project manager must deliver and documents the needs and expectations of the sponsor and the stakeholders. Once gathered, analyzed, and documented by the project manager, these requirements become critical in defining the scope of the project. It also creates the work breakdown structure, the schedule, the budget, and is used in the procurement of goods and services needed from vendors and contractors. Different industries may categorize their requirements as a business requirement, a stakeholder requirement, the project requirement, quality requirements, and for my IT friends out there, a solution requirement. In essence, the Collect Requirements process gathers all the information needed from all the sources available to ensure that the project does what it has to do to the degree in which it has to do it. The first input into the Collect Requirements process is the Scope Management Plan. The Scope Management Plan helps to provide clarity on the kinds of requirements that need to be collected. The Requirements Management Plan is a subsidiary plan of the Project Management Plan that contains the processes that the project manager will use to collect the requirements. The Stakeholder Management Plan is a subsidiary plan that's used to understand and manage the level of stakeholder participation and their communication requirements. A project manager needs to keep an eye on the big picture in order to understand what requirements are needed to break down that big picture into manageable tasks. The project charter is used to develop high-level descriptions of the project so that the detailed product requirements can be developed. Who does the project manager need to talk to in order to figure out a requirement? The best way a project manager can figure that out is to check out the Stakeholder Register. The Stakeholder Register is used to identify stakeholders who can provide detailed information on project requirements. The tools and techniques used during the Collect Requirements process include interviews. Interviews are used to get information from stakeholders by talking to them directly. Interviews are typically conducted by project managers and subject matter experts who can explain to the stakeholders what the project will accomplish and why it matters. They're also typically used in large government contracts that may have a lot of confidential information. Focus groups bring together subject matter experts and stakeholders. In a focus group, a trained moderator is used to guide the group through a conversational discussion that helps determine attitudes and expectations about a proposed project. Facilitated workshops differ from focus groups because, although still moderated by a subject matter expert, a facilitated workshop brings together key stakeholders that will help define the requirements of the deliverable. One of the most common types of facilitated workshops used in the software industry is what they call a JAD session, or Joint Application and Design Sessions. Good project managers know the importance of creating an environment where people can safely and creatively process ideas. These group creativity techniques are a good way to help both the stakeholders and the project manager identify and define key requirements needed in the project and expected in the product, process, or result. Some of the most commonly used group creativity techniques are brainstorming, nominal group techniques, the Delphi technique, idea and mind mapping techniques, affinity diagrams, and the multi-criteria decision analysis. The hardest part of a project manager's job is not the project itself. It's guiding stakeholders to come together and make a decision. Even though everyone involved may know or think they know what the project objective is and what the deliverables should be, everyone always has a different opinion on how it needs to get there. Group decision-making techniques help the project manager facilitate these decisions to the satisfaction of all the stakeholders. There are a lot of techniques that a project manager could use to drive the decisions forward, but the ones that you will really need to know are unanimity, majority, consensus, plurality, and dictatorship. If a project manager needs to get some quick information, questionnaires and surveys can be used to quickly accumulate information from large groups of people. You know that guy looking over your right shoulder while you do your work? No, not your boss. He's looking over your left shoulder. You know, that guy you don't know and is asking you a lot of questions. That's the project manager using observation techniques. Observation is a tool and technique used to study a worker as he performs his job. The objective in observation is to know how the worker performs his job, not to evaluate the worker's performance, but to capture detailed requirements that may not be evident through interviews and other methods. I have a good friend that used to be my neighbor when I lived in California. She's an industrial designer for a large, well-known toy manufacturer. Anytime I would go into her apartment to chat and have coffee, she would have various toys in all stages of disassembly. She was taking apart these toys and using their mechanisms to create new toys. Honestly, I always teased her that her workshop looked like a teddy bear torture chamber. Yeah, it was that bad. But the work she did was fascinating. She was creating prototypes. Making a prototype is a method of obtaining feedback on requirements by providing a working model of an expected product before actually building it. The advantage of this is that an idea becomes a tangible object and can be touched and used by the stakeholders, and it allows the project team to understand what works and what doesn't work. The organization the project manager is managing the project for isn't the only organization in the world. Benchmarking takes the processes being used in the project and compares them to processes other organizations have used to manage similar projects. This is a good way to identify good practices and the processes that have worked before in the past. A context diagram is a visual description of the project scope. It's kind of like a network diagram, but instead of showing a logical progression of tasks, it shows how people interact with a business system or equipment, like a computer network or bulldozers in a quarry. Document analysis is when the project manager analyzes all the paperwork that's generated and uses that information that's relevant to the requirements. The outputs of the collect requirements process include requirements documentation. Requirements documentation describes how the individual requirements will meet the business need. Usually, these requirements start out at a high level and then are defined as more details about the project requirements become known. The requirement traceability matrix is a table that traces requirements throughout the project lifecycle. It's usually used to help identify the source of the requirement after it's collected. This matrix can also include information about who owns the requirement and what the current status of the requirement is. The collect requirements process is all about understanding what is needed to satisfy the stakeholders and creating requirements documentation that reflects that understanding. When a project manager understands the stakeholders' requirements, they'll be able to understand and manage the stakeholders' expectations and complete a successful project.